A leftist coalition won the most seats in the 2024 French parliamentary elections. How will this affect the rest of the world? Joining me now to discuss is Leighton Gray, a legal scholar, cultural analyst, and host of the world-renowned Gray Matter podcast. Leighton, welcome to the show.
Hi, Stacey. Thanks for having me on the program. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too, because I love that you are keeping such close track of this. Now, of course, Canadians have a close connection to Europe, and you're looking at what's happening there and seeing some consistencies with things that have happened in elections here in the United States. Tell us more.
Well, I think what we're seeing right now is a kind of a titanic struggle between good and evil. And to put different sort of labels on it, I think the struggle is between globalism and nationalism. And those of us who think that nationalism is a good thing, pride in God, family, and country, are up against globalists who have sort of their own, if you can call it a Pentateuch. And essentially the recipe is to scare everybody. The 20th century scholar, American scholar H.L. Mencken once wrote that the urge to save humanity is almost always a false front for the urge to rule. And this is what we're seeing play out in the United States, in Canada, in France, and Great Britain recently in their national elections. We're seeing with the rise of populism, the reaction from the left is to squeeze even more tightly upon the reins of power. They've sort of had their way since 2020, since the pandemic hit. And really everything seems to be culminating in these national elections leading up to the big one, which is, of course, on November 4th in your country.
So I got to tell you, Leighton, I thought it was so interesting to watch. It was just like 2020. In the evening of the election in 2020, you have Donald Trump decisively ahead, but for some reason, the election wasn't called in his favor. We're all waiting. I remember staying up until 3 a.m. waiting for them to call it and finally giving in like an angry toddler and going to bed. And waking up the next day to find that 668,000 votes or some nonsense like that had been counted. And then Biden was the president. And the polls didn't support it. The county counts didn't support it. Because usually here in America, because we have cities, states, and counties, we have like a little over 3,800 counties in the country. And in order to win all of the battleground states, there's a certain number of counties that corresponds to that. It's just math. And so you have Biden winning the electoral college, winning the popular vote, but not winning the counties. How do you win the votes in the counties without winning the counties themselves, right? So anyone who asked about that was immediately labeled an election denier, and some people lost their jobs. And so everybody clammed up because they're like, well, I can't afford to lose my job, but what is going on here? And then it was the irregularities, the ballot harvesting, and then all these videos started to come out and people would say, well, that's propaganda. So we watched. I saw Marine Le Pen clapping. They had a video on her. It looked like her coalition had won. The actual vote count showed that she had an enormous number of votes. But for some reason, after a few days had gone by, all of a sudden the looting and burning stopped momentarily. And everyone on the left looked up and the Labor Party had won instead. And I don't get it. I mean, obviously, I think I do get it, but I don't get how this is allowed.
Well, it's a great question, but I think what we're seeing is just essentially the globalist equivalent of playground bullying. When it looked as though Marine Le Pen was going to win, the left came out in full force with rioting, with looting, with threats of violence, and they were able to essentially bully these other parties into joining a leftist coalition controlled by Macron, with his puppet on a string prime minister that everybody there seems to hate. And lo and behold, even though most French people, at least most French voters, don't want this government, this leftist government, this globalist government that's tied into the EU, that is dedicated to climate scare, that's dedicated to all the weird sex stuff, that's dedicated to Ukraine. All this stuff that they don't want, they wanted their country to get back to being focused on France, to do something about the very serious migrant problem that exists there and really is existing throughout the West. They're stuck with this government that they don't want. Similarly in Britain, We have a Labour Party. Their leader, Keir Starmer, that name sounds like something out of 1939 Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
He's their new prime minister, and he gets a historic victory, 2/3 of the votes in the House of Commons, with only 1/3 of the popular vote. And what's he dedicated to? Well, all the globalist stuff. He says the number one concern for Britons should be Ukraine. Well, why? Nobody knows why. That their second most serious concern should be the climate. Shifting to Canada, well, we have Justin Trudeau, who is the least popular prime minister in the history of polling in our country. He's off at the NATO summit in Washington, and what is he saying? He says, well, the post World War II peace that all of us have become accustomed to and really like, especially in the West, that's all over. We have to get ready for war, and our number one concern after Ukraine is the climate. And in our country, on a per capita basis, Canada, strangely, has given more money to Ukraine than any other country, $14 billion. He gave another $500 million commitment to Ukraine. Now, Canada has the highest per capita private debt, that's household debt, in the G7. Properly, we shouldn't even be in the G7 anymore. And we have the highest per capita public debt in the Western world, even surpassing the United States. We can't afford to be giving $500 million to Ukraine, but we are. And the question is why? Why is this happening? Why is the left so committed? And I think the reason why they're committed to these causes that regular working people don't care a lot about. They care more about their families and their jobs and being able to afford groceries and keep a roof over their heads. The reason why the left is committed to this is because they have learned over time that the best way to control everybody is by scaring them to death. And so we have to be kept in a constant state of emergency, just as Mencken wrote 100 years ago. Being afraid of the sun monster, being afraid of Putin, being afraid of just about everything except government power, because of course government is good and they will take care of us. But all we have to do is sacrifice, our liberty. But as your former president Dwight D. Eisenhower famously said, if you want to be perfectly safe, the best place you can go is to a prison, because you'll be well looked after, and the only thing you have to give up is your liberty.
Yeah, except in American prisons, you could easily be killed there, or beaten to death, or beaten to within an inch of death, and then beaten again and again and again. I mean, there isn't any place that's safe. Even right. It strains the imagination to think of all of the different places you could try to go to be safe, and then as soon as you name that place off, me being a pretty creative person, I have a wild imagination. I can tell you how you could die there. There's no place you can name off for me, Leighton, that you think, no, this is definitely safe. I'll tell you how you can die there. I've watched
we're
enough
mortal.
movies. Right. You could die there of natural causes. I mean, you're going to die. Everyone's going to die. I find it interesting that in Paris and in the United States, there was a similar effect in the 2020 election. The sustained rioting over George Floyd frightened a lot of Americans into thinking they needed to vote for the left. It was implied, which I thought was interesting, because we're so intelligent, we can tell when we're being bullied through violence by implication. In other words, they never said, don't vote for the left and we'll continue to riot for the rest of your life. They just implied it, and people got the message and, against their will, voted against their better interests. But there's something that has also happened here in America since the pandemic. People have become less afraid. And so I wish that for the French people. And I love that, you guys have spent $14 billion. That's a lot of money. We've spent well over $200 billion here in America, and we borrow $1 for every $2 that we spend. So we collect $2 in tax, we borrow $1, and now our total debt is a greater percentage than GDP than people were screaming about during the Reagan years. So we're over the financial cliff. And actually dancing a waltz as we go down. Leighton, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. You are a thought leader from Canada. We love it. Leighton Gray, host of the Gray Matter podcast. I hope to talk to you again soon. Have a great weekend.
Me too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Coming up, Democrat David Axelrod lays bare the dilemma facing his party. Stay with us.